Hi guys, welcome to A&B Homemaker, a place where we are redefining the modern homemaker through recipes, thoughts, ideas, so much more. And today I'm excited to share some of the things that I've been thinking about lately. And so the last time we got together, we talked about listening. We talked about how important it is to listen, especially as we are moving into 2021 and we are all trying to cultivate strategies to help us make sure that we are accomplishing all the goals that we have set for 2021. And so, of course, listening is a key part of creating any strategy. But once you get down the skill of listening, now it's time to be obedient to what you've heard. And so today I want to talk to you guys about obedience. Okay, so we've got listening down. Now we're moving on to being obedient to what God has told us to do. And sometimes that can be a tall order, especially when God is asking you to do something that you find particularly challenging or you really have been dreading and don't want to do. And I'm sure we can think of a few examples of things that we've had to do but didn't want to do, whether it's maybe a surgery or a medical procedure that we really needed to get done, but we were really nervous about it, the time it was going to take off, all the intricate steps that we're going to have to figure out with that, or even going to the doctor to get tested for things and to figure out what's wrong can be nerve-wracking, or possibly having a difficult conversation. Having a conversation that you know is going to be hard, you know it's going to be challenging, mentally and emotionally taxing, but you need to start working on rebuilding that relationship. And so sometimes we find ourselves with these instructions to do these really hard things that we really don't want to do, but we're trying to do them because God told us to do them and that this is the path and the will that He has for our life. And so as I started thinking through the Bible and looking for examples of different ways that people were obedient and really submitted themselves to what God was telling them to do, I came across the story that I'm sure we're all familiar with of Jesus going to the cross. And so we see Jesus going to the cross, submitting himself to die for our sins so that we can be saved. And then, of course, we know that he rose on the third day with all power in his hands. And it's, the story of Christianity. It's the foundation of our faith. And so as I was looking at that and I started thinking about what that took for him to be obedient to that call, I started studying a particular piece of Jesus's life that happens right before the trial and the crucifixion begins. And that is Jesus's prayer time while he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so this is covered in multiple books of the Bible. However, today we're going to be focusing on what it says in Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. And so at this point in Jesus' life, he has been walking, talking, healing, teaching. He's been doing all of this great work. And so now we're rapidly approaching the time where his trial is going to begin, and then he's going to go to the cross. And so as he's preparing himself for that, he takes his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he pulls himself, Peter, James, and John aside, and he says, "Hey, will you guys come off to the side and will you pray with me?" And so Jesus steps off to the side with them and he begins to pray. And he begins the first in what is a series of 3 prayers to God. And he begins praying to God about asking God to pass this cup from him. And when he says pass this cup from him so that he doesn't, he's basically saying, God, how can I avoid having to drink from this cup? Drink from the cup of an unjust trial, from the cup of being beaten and humiliated, the cup of being hung on a cross, the cup of dying. He's saying, God, is there any way that we don't have to do this? How can we get past this? But ultimately in his prayer, he ends it with saying, but your will be done. I'm asking you for what I would like to not have happen because I know the plan. But also, if this is what you decided, I will do it. And so we know that Jesus is in a really intense moment of prayer, especially, it's a deep anguish because he understands the extent of what is about to happen and how painful it's going to be and all of that he's about to go through, which no one would be excited to sign up for. And so we see that Jesus is intensely praying to God, and he's so intense that Luke describes it, the intensity of his prayer is that he has sweat like the drops of blood coming off of him. That is how intensely he is praying in this prayer time with God. And then we see that he ends the first prayer and he goes back to check on the disciples, and he finds the Peter, James, and John, who he is asked to come to the side with him and to pray with him. He finds that they are sleeping. And of course that's disheartening, but he continues on. And then we see him come into his second prayer. And so the second prayer, he goes back in to come before God in prayer and ask him, again, Lord, can you pass this cup for me? Can you make it so this isn't something that I have to go through? And yet again, Jesus is open about his willingness to submit, saying, God, but if this is your will, I will still do it. And then he comes back and he does it a third time. And he continues that third prayer the same way, just asking God to pass this cup. But yet and still, if this is your will, I will submit to it. And I think looking at how Jesus was willing to submit to the will of God, even when it was going to be painful, even when it was going to be beyond unpleasant, just horrific, humiliating. It was going to be some of the worst experiences a person can go through. And he was still, knowing all of that, knowing what it was going to cost him, he was still willing to submit to God's plan. And it made me wonder how often, as we're going into our prayer times, are we spending so much of our time giving God our wish list, giving God all of the things that we want without asking and making sure that we're aligning with what he wants? How often are we going into prayer saying, hey God, this is what I want, but also what do you want for me to be doing? What is your strategy? What is your plan for our life? Because if we truly believe that God knows all and that God has our best interest in mind and that he has plans for our hopes and to give us a future, then it would only make sense that we want to make sure that what his plans are also our plans, and that we're incorporating that into our prayer time and also submitting to things even when they don't seem pleasant. And so finally, we see that God's will is moving forward and that Jesus is going to go to the cross and that Jesus submits to God's plan. And so when I was thinking about what is submission, submission is getting behind or underneath or accepting someone's plans or their goal or their mission. And so in this case, Jesus accepted that God's goal was for him to redeem humanity and to allow humanity to be back in fellowship with God. It was making sure that sin that had separated us from God, the prices of sin had to be paid, and the price of sin is death. And God's plan was to send Jesus to die on a cross for our sins so that we could have community and to have fellowship and relationship with God. And so we see that Jesus has submitted himself to this plan. He has accepted this plan. And he has accepted that he is going to a cross to die for our sins so that we can have relationship with God. And so in that, it really made me think of how submission is an act of obedience. And so ultimately, we are listening to what God is telling us, and then we are acting on it. We are obedient to what he is calling us to do. And even when it doesn't seem good, even when we know it's not going to be good in that moment, but trusting and having faith that ultimately God's plan is going to lead to good. And it is important to note that this was not something that Jesus was forced into. This was something that he submitted to freely and willingly. And we see that as the men are coming to take Jesus and start the process of the trial, we see that Peter comes to defend him and even cuts off a man's ear. And Jesus tells him to stop. And Jesus explains that if I wanted to stop this, I could call down 12 legions of angels. I could end this if I wanted to, but I won't, because I'm here to fulfill my Father's will. I'm here to fulfill the prophecies that have come before me. There's been a plan in place, and I'm submitting to the plan. I'm submitting to the mission, to the goals that God has set before me. And so that is something that I am forever grateful for, that his submission and his obedience allowed me to have salvation today, and it allows you to also have salvation today, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And so as I think about the goals and the plans that I have for 2021 and listening to God to make sure that my plans align with his plans, but also asking myself questions about, am I being obedient to what God is actually telling me to do? And so with that, I will leave you with these two questions. Are you listening to God? And are you submitting to the plans that he has given you? And are there areas of your life that you need to become obedient to God's will? So I hope you all take time to think about those things. Let me know in the comments how you are going to be carrying out obedience in 2021. Bye.